Welcome to the World City Summit 2021 session on Complexity Science for Resilient and Adaptable Cities. I am Yixuan, your MC for this webinar. Today's webinar is held in partnership with the Urban Sustainability R&D E-Symposia 2021, a year-long series of webinars co-organized by 20 ministries and agencies. The E-Symposia seeks to share with the community our research, innovation, and Enterprise 2025 plans under the Urban Solutions and Sustainability domain, and to forge new partnerships to promote interdisciplinary research and translate research outcomes for deployment. We are fortunate to have with us today Professor Michael Batty, Chairman at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, Associate Professor Roman Carrasco from the National University of Singapore, and Mr. Joseph Hargrave, Director of ARUP's Foresight Team. Unfortunately, Dr. Lee Min Hee, Director of Research at the Center for Livable Cities, is unable to join us today. To start us off, I'd like to invite our moderator, Mr. Huang Zhongwen, Director at the Urban Redevelopment Authority, to give us an opening remark. Zhongwen, please.
Thank you, Yixuan. I think the theme of today's symposia is a complexity science for resilient and adaptable cities. We often think about a city as being buzzing with many different activities, being highly diverse in the communities and stakeholders, and it certainly involves many urban systems interacting together. It involves economic, social, environmental systems, as well as physical and increasingly digital infrastructure. In making Singapore a great city to live, work, and play, our planners have to consider a wide range of needs, find ways to balance these needs, and work out an optimal way to meet them within the resources that we have. But changes are taking place fast in many aspects at the same time. Aging population, business forms, technologies, climate change, and even public health. And it is certain that these are evolving, but it is not often as certain how fast and how much impact they will have. Many of these issues are connected, and in some ways they are more apparent, and in some ways that are far less clear at the onset. So planning for cities remain relevant in creating livable homes for people, conducive conditions for businesses to provide good jobs, and sustainable environment for people, flora, and fauna. However, we need new tools that enable us to better navigate this increasing complexity, that will enable us to make more informed choices on the options to take and be more responsive to the situations that arise. In this COVID period, I think everyone is able to relate to the importance of being able to adapt our city to new needs that are emerging and to be able to handle surprises that occur. Everything is connected and everything relates to each other. This, as a quote from Lao Tzu, I think is an important point. And in fact, we may not just be having a partial picture of these connections. We may, in fact, not have a full picture of what are all the dots we need to connect. And like seeing a swan gracefully gliding on the lake, we may not and often do not fully see how it is exerting itself beneath the surface. And therefore, there has been an effort co-led by the Center for Livable Cities together with URA as a partner with agencies to explore how research in urban complexity can be harnessed to strengthen how we understand urban dynamics, to plan for our city in the future. And in the next few years, we will be focusing on 4 key themes under the Cities of Tomorrow R&D program, focusing on, first, livable city. How do we plan for more adaptive and inclusive town for all ages? Secondly, sustainable city. How do we foster a circular economy for sustainable development? Third, in healthy environment, how do we plan for green and healthy places? And fourthly, in resilient city, how do we plan for post-COVID-19 city? I think we are very excited today to have with us 3 very esteemed speakers who will share their perspectives on how the lens of complexity can be applied. With Prof. Michael Batty on the need to shift our mindsets to how we understand and look at urban activities, with Roman Carrasco on how we understand the role and impact of urban ecosystem services, and with Joseph Hargrave on how do we go forward to create a city that can recover and regenerate itself. And I think I also look forward to the conversations at the panel discussion after this. Thank you to the speakers, and I'll hand it back to Yixuan.
Thank you, Zhongwen. Let us invite Prof. Michael Batty who will share on complexity science for adaptable, resilient, and anti-fragile cities.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about complexity science in rather general terms. Our hosts have just given a very interesting view about complexity science as sort of a mindset. And in some senses, what I'd like to explain to you this morning and leave you with is the notion that complexity science is a way of thinking about things. There are obviously techniques, and I'll mention a few of them in that sense. And we're looking at it in this context for resilient and what I call anti-fragile, or rather what Nicholas Taleb calls anti-fragile, those adaptable cities. So we're talking about how we can think about cities through the lens of complexity science. So let me begin with some definitions really about complex systems. They involve multiple sets of relationships that bind their component parts together. Now, of course, many things in contemporary life and in science are really in this context. But we can think of cities as being composed of literally millions of semi-autonomous entities linked in multiple ways, producing relationships so entangled that it makes their understanding difficult. That's very important because networks will be pretty central to what I'm saying this morning. The difficulties we have with these entangled relationships between the various bits are that they're very difficult to unravel, often at times impossible. Cities are contained of hierarchies of these components. If we look at cities, we can see hierarchies of transport, retail centers, different types of housing and so on and so forth. And generally speaking, complex systems, and this is important, are built from the bottom up. In some senses, many approaches to cities in the past have looked at cities from the top down. The systems approach is a way of looking at cities from the top down. And in some senses, if they're built from the bottom up, from individual parts, they tend naturally to be more resilient. If they break, as it were, at the bottom level, in some sense, where action really takes place, then the breaks can heal very quickly. And these are sort of systems that Nicholas Taleb calls anti-fragile, basically, in contrast to fragile systems, which do in fact work. Okay, so in most cases, the number of breaks is a small fraction of the whole, but the size of breaks is unpredictable. For example, the break caused by the pandemic, for example, is unanticipated. Now, networks are wonderful ways of visualizing this complexity. And it shows that cities are full of redundancy. There are many paths through the various networks that define what goes on in cities that you can actually pass through. And if you break those paths, you'll find another one. And this is called a degree of redundancy. So cities, against this background, are intrinsically unpredictable. Now, this insight is not new, but it's gaining in power in the sense that the notion about predicting the future, we've retreated really from the sort of heavy science of 100, 200 years or so ago to the notion that many, many things are contingent in this sense. So I like to paraphrase George Box, the statistician here, who said, he actually said all models are wrong and some are useful, but I've changed it here to all predictions are wrong, but some are useful. And complexity is a way of handling this in some senses. Okay, so the seeds of change in cities, all of these autonomous entities that make cities work, they continually mutate. And part of the healing process is indeed the very act of mutation. And where cities are headed is unpredictable in that sense. So history matters. These are all cliches that define complexity theory. Cities in this sense mutate to innovate in some senses. So let me look at some examples of this sort of criticality in terms of networks and cities to give you some idea that we can take this way of thinking, indeed, even further in that sense. Here are some networks, and I'll just go through them very quickly. On the left, we have the familiar nightlights network, basically, that shows the distribution of energy in cities. That's Tokyo Bay, and you can sort of see the morphology built out. The second picture along is London, Greater London, basically, and retail activity, and you can see it spread along the radial roads and in the concentric things. The next example is traffic flow in Lisbon. In that sense, and it looks like a map of blood flow in this particular context. And on the immediate right, we have the tube network in London, which again is a map of blood flow. In fact, my next slide will actually show you that working. And in some senses, networks distribute energy in cities in that sense, and they're intrinsically dynamic. In fact, my next picture, in fact, let's see if this works. Yes, what you're seeing here, and I've shown this to various people in Singapore before, I know, but what we're seeing here is flow, basically. There's a little counter there telling you where we are. We're on Monday at the moment, and that's the peak hour that's just passed on Monday morning. And this is the evening peak on Monday. And then a little bit later, we've got a slight evening peak in the city, basically, an entertainment peak. There we are Tuesday morning again, Wednesday morning, basically. Now, one of the key features of this is that every element, every flow on the segment is different from day to day. There's great heterogeneity. There's overall pattern, but great heterogeneity in this picture. Now, think of this picture blown up 1,000,000 times. My next slide shows you not the tube map, but this is railways in London, including the tube, basically. It's not a map you see in a familiar way. And think of that network, but then think of the bus network, the walking network, the bike network on top of that, and then think about email networks, web links, and so on. And you get an idea of the mind-boggling complexity of what cities are all about. And our mission is to actually inquire into cities and actually begin to tame that complexity and understand elements of it. To some extent, of course, a complex system is almost impossible to understand in that sense. So there is a kind of tension there in a sense. So what happens if the network's disrupted? I just made up a little network here and you can see the clusters, the subsystems, etc. If we actually cut basically in that sense, I've cut in that way, I've cut those links and I've taken out 1, 2 links in the little subsets. And that's the kind of picture we get. It's still connected in this sense. We've taken out about 1/3 of the links. In fact, in real systems, there is in physics an area called percolation theory that suggests that you can knock out 2/3 of the network and it will still function in most naturally occurring networks. And this is called the percolation threshold. Here are some examples that we've done with Oyster card data in London. Here, for example, we close on the immediate right Liverpool Street, which is on the Circle line, and then we close Green Park. In the bottom left, as it were, on the left there. And you can see the impact. If we close Green Park, it's much more accessible in the system than Liverpool Street, in a sense. So we can begin to see the extent using networks of how we can actually break and indeed heal. And here, in fact, is a more detailed one where, in fact, we've looked at closure of stations and so on, which lead to movements onto buses and so on in that sense. Now, I can't resist showing you this picture. This is big data in 1939. Of course, all of this tube data, this rail data now, as in Singapore and many cities in the world, is actually automated and collected directly. But of course, in a way, nothing's new under the sun. This is a picture in 1939 of young ladies working for London Transport actually counting tickets to get origins and destinations. It's amazing that this picture was taken 4 months before war broke out in Europe in some senses. Sort of life goes on, so to speak. But I'm interested in the fact that many of these ideas go back a long way, and we're only really in the position now where we can do something about them. Here are some more pictures, and I'm going to go through these very quickly. There are networks everywhere in cities in that sense. And here are some more media networks, Facebook traces on the top left, Flickr activity in London, and then tweets in Europe and London, etc. And then, of course, the whole question of mapping the internet or internet and internets and so on in that sense, to get some sense of how things are connected together. So let me sum up. We're at the beginning of developing the right kind of science or sciences for understanding how cities grow and evolve. What I've mentioned here is multiple functions, multiple networks. We need to get a real handle on this, and network science is a good way of proceeding. It's not the only way by any means. We're also interested in flows on networks. Networks are only the carriers, basically. What happens on the networks, how we behave and so on, is really all important. And we need to figure out generalizations about human behaviors in these systems, which are not necessarily stable. They can be very volatile with a purpose in some sense, but we determine how cities form and function in terms of these behaviors. And this is all about urban dynamics. And let me repeat to finish, we are really but at the beginning in terms of thinking about how complexity theory can help us to think about cities. Now, the last slide I'm going to show you is that I wrote a book on complexity in cities, MIT Press, about 15 years ago. And more recently, if you go to the Urban Informatics, just Google it basically, then this is an open access book that contains a whole variety of new techniques that relate to sensing and data and movement and so on in cities. So you can actually get that simply by going to the web and clicking on it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tan, for that. And I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Prof. Batty, for sharing with us on the bottom-up evolution of complexities and the importance of networks and flows in city resilience. Our next speaker, Associate Professor Roman Carrasco, will share on the modeling of human-nature relationships in the context of climate change. Dr. Carrasco, please.
Okay, thank you for the invite. And today I will be talking about how climate change will threaten the supply and demand and of ecosystem services, and as such, the human-nature relationships in Singapore from the perspective of complex science. And to describe the problem, I will use a simple framework on ecosystem services supply and demand. So the way it works, on the one hand, we have nature, green and blue spaces in Singapore, and then we have people. And people get benefits from nature in the form of ecosystem services. It could be a walk in the park. It could be the mental health that we get from spending some time in nature, or the exercising we do, or there might be many other services. So if we translate nature in this supply of these services and the demand that people get on these services from nature, we can derive some benefits through this marrying of the supply and demand. We can intervene through some form of co-production, maybe making green spaces accessible to people and providing facilities in green spaces that will optimize the marrying of the supply and demand of ecosystem services. The problem with climate change is that it will threat this supply and demand relationship. It can affect the supply side. For example, it may affect the quality of our ecosystems. We are going to have to sustain long droughts, higher temperatures, and many of our species might not be ready to resist. So there will be a decrease in the supply, and it might also affect the demand in the way that it might become too hot. It will not be comfortable to spend long times outdoor in green and blue spaces, which might undermine the matching of the supply and demand. As such, we will expect that the benefits that Singaporeans get from our natural capital will decrease. And this impact of climate change on ecosystem services is going to be across many types of ecosystem services. This is some research with the natural capital, and this is a national survey trying to understand what are the ecosystem services that are perceived as most important by Singaporeans. So, for example, being a city in nature is important for our branding, to attract foreign investment, for recreation, tourism, and climate change is going to put a threat on that. Some of the most important ecosystem services are mental health, physical health, and as I was saying, they are likely to be affected by climate change. Also, regulating services related to water, coastal defense, temperature reduction for the urban heat island effect might also be impacted by climate change. So what we have is quite a challenge ahead of us. So as the supply of ecosystem services and the demand might be affected by climate change, many of these very important ecosystem services for Singapore that make Singapore a thriving, livable city are under threat. So we have to rethink the way we do urban planning and manage urban systems to be able to adapt and to provide the best solutions for Singapore. And following from the previous talk from Prof. Batty, I think it's interesting that we start looking into behavior, because understanding human behavior is what will help us to provide adaptive solutions that will help us to mitigate the effects of climate change. I'm going to show you some examples of research we have done. We benefit quite a bit from big data from Singtel, Data Spark. These are mobile phone data of people movement in Singapore. And they're interesting because they can allow us to understand how people travel from different parts in Singapore to a given park. For example, this is for Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. So we can understand the travel cost that they invest to go to the park, and then we can understand how long they spend in the park. And these are some form of revealed behavior that allow us to see why people will choose to go to the park and the different climatic conditions. So the data look like this. We have like time series of origin destination, and then we can get different peaks, for example, a weekend effect, a bank holiday effect. And then we can also break down for different ethnicities. And then we can run some data analysis, and then we can combine the visitorship of the park with the temperature and rainfall and different climatic variables. And we start getting some insights. For example, we identify a threshold of 31.7 degrees centigrade, beyond which having a sunny day doesn't make green space more appealing. More interestingly, when when the temperature is hotter, the duration of people that spend in the park, as denoted by the mobile phone, got reduced. And this is worrying because it indicates that this supply and demand are likely to not meet, at least for not as long, under climate change. And that will come with increased mental health problems and physical health problems, making Singapore less attractive and weakening our human capital. More research with this, trying to understand behavior, we use something called discrete choice analysis to understand the preferences of Singaporeans for a hypothetical new neighborhood park. And here we have the marginal willingness to pay for the characteristics of the park. For example, they value quite a bit facilities like toilets or boardwalks. They appreciate when parks have a high biodiversity, and they appreciate quite a bit when parks are able to reduce temperature. And combining this with models from the terrestrial team from the natural capital, we're able to relate the presence of a new park with reductions in temperature. Some other things that they have the opposite of willingness to pay, willingness to accept, makes the park have less value is when the park gets crowded. So when the behavior leads to overcrowding of the park decreases its value. And expectedly, distance also plays a role in the value of the park. If the park is far from people, they have to incur more cost to go to the park, it has less value to them. So now let me try to bring some of these behavior insights that we gain into a small simulation tool of urban planning that considers the behavior, the adaptive behavior of people, and the implementation of a new green space. So I mean that this is a small schematic representation. So we have a high urban heat island effect, high density of people. So if we look at the map in a static fashion, we will say, oh, this is the optimal location of a new park because we have a lot of people and we need to decrease the temperature. And we can put the park there, and this looks well and good under a static representation. But if we account for complexity and adaptive behavior, what we have is that this new park is in a location that is able to attract many people that live nearby. And as a result, what we have is a crowded park that is not going to deliver the same level of services in terms of restoration, de-stressing Singaporeans. And we're going to have other parks that are now oversupplied, right? So we have more parks and they are being underutilized. So, however, if we were to consider that this behavior is going to occur, probably we will have chosen a different park location. It could be here, and then we have the same reduction of temperature, and we get a much more even utilization of parks. So this is just a small example, and we are trying to develop these types of adaptive complex models. So basically we have a behavior travel cost model to see how far the people will go to the new park. And then we can work out how crowded we expect the park to become, depending on the location where we put it. And then combining with models that relate urban heat island effect and green spaces, we can estimate how much temperature reduction we can attain depending on the location on the green space. Okay, so these are some of the maps that we get. So this is green here means that has less value. If we put a green space here, it will get crowded because there is a high density for the population. However, the travel time in terms of lower value will occur in the west because it will be far from the most of the population. In terms of temperature reduction, yellow areas are the areas where we attain the biggest temperature reduction. And putting all together and taking into account this adaptive behavior, we can identify that these yellow areas are the areas that, all things considered, make more sense for the increase in the supply of the green space. And then once we have models that can take into account of behavior, we can try to think of temperature predictions or increases in population density or enhancing existing parks with biodiversity. So yeah, just to bring things together, climate change poses a threat to the supply and demand of ecosystem services in Singapore, and it's quite a fundamental threat that we have there. And one way to adjust and to make sure that our interventions make the most of the scarce land that we have is to consider the adaptive behavior of people. So I think it makes sense to start thinking in terms of the complexity of the system and how the system will adapt to the changes that we make to it. And I would like to thank the Natural Capital Project and these researchers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Carrasco, for the sharing on the importance of adaptive planning to balance ecosystem services supply and demand under climate change. Our final speaker, Mr. Joseph Hargrave, will share about regenerative cities and how ARUP seeks to tackle complex urban problems today. Mr. Hargrave, please.
Thank you, Yijin, and yeah, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to speak to you today. There's really two key components to my presentation. One talks about this emerging future paradigm of regenerative design and how we need to shift more towards regenerative urban systems. And the second is to give you an example of Shanghai Urban Drainage Master Plan, which really worked with complexity and breaking down complexity in order to identify the best solutions for urban drainage at scale. So I'll start with a look at the future of regenerative design and what that shift could look like. And I think this is important in that context that we're discussing today, because many of the challenges that we are trying to tackle today are all focused on the transformation of complex systems. So if you think about climate change, the shift to net zero, energy system transformation, the opportunities of creating healthier and more livable cities, these are all systems-based challenges and complex challenges that require innovation at scale across multiple actors, components, and domains. And one of the potential paradigms that we can utilize for this going forward is the idea of a shift towards more regenerative design and regenerative systems. If we think about, if you like, the predominant paradigm for sustainability today, it's very much about minimizing ecological loss. So reducing waste consumption, reducing carbon emissions. However, in many cases, the damage we have done to our natural world has already been too much. And we have to now start to have a dialogue and start to think much more in the context of restoring systems and achieving ecological gain. So an infrastructure project that consumes more carbon than it emits, or a building that cleans water rather than consumes water, or other systems that enhance biodiversity rather than further threatening biodiversity. So we have to really have a big switch there in terms of how we think about design, how we think about cities, and also what our objectives and aims are when it comes towards sustainable development, because we believe that we have to move towards this more regenerative future. Well, what do we mean by that in more detail? Well, there isn't a perfect definition of what regenerative design is at the moment, and what I'm sharing on the screen now is very much a working draft definition of how perhaps you can distinguish between sustainable, restorative, and regenerative. And again, I'm stressing that it's not perfect yet, but if we break down what it might mean in terms of ambition, ecology, approach, and outcome, in terms of regenerative, we're talking about really reinventing systems. We're talking about enabling a holistic human and planetary health approach, which really brings human health and planetary health together in one. And again, so you're talking about the complex system of nature and ecology and the complex system of human activity, from economies to the design and function of cities. We're talking about designing integrated and self-sustaining living systems. So this is the idea of, self-regeneration, reaching equilibriums at different times through design. And then the outcome is really a restored environmental health and a self-adapting system that can sustain itself over time. So it's a big ambition, and as we've already heard, it does require an approach that is built on the understanding of complex systems, the understanding of networks, and the understanding of things working together. One example that of course feeds into this is the circular economy, and there again it is about understanding future flows of materials and components, and all of that requires a very much systems-driven approach. So while today one could argue that our approach to understanding, managing, and exploring natural systems and cycles and human-made systems and cycles does overlap somewhat, it perhaps doesn't quite overlap enough. And if we want to move towards a more regenerative work, we have to see ourselves much more as one and understand, planet and human health in a holistic way, and move towards this idea of integrated and regenerative systems, which requires, again, a deep understanding of the complexity of the world, a deep understanding of networks and how things influence each other. Now, one example I want to give of where we as a firm have tried to understand and deal with complexity at the large urban scale is some work we did for the Shanghai Urban Drainage Master Plan. Shanghai, like many other cities, has grown very, very fast over the past decades, and that has increased the amount of impermeable surfaces across the city. And that in turn, including the impacts of climate change, has increased the risk of surface water flooding and stormwater runoff, which is causing flooding and also contributes to the pollution of the water network. And so the team, together with the Shanghai Local Design Institute, really took a systems-led approach and utilized a range of advanced technologies to deliver an approach across blue, green, and gray infrastructure. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. It was an 11-month collaboration covering 640 square kilometers, so a huge area. And the idea is really to develop a more integrated approach that looks at the dynamics of different components and considers different components and how they can work together most effectively. So the principle here is really that interventions that we design and put in place in the city have to be implemented across a series of interconnected systems. And in this case, we're talking about the systems of governance, green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, and gray infrastructure. So gray infrastructure being drainage systems, blue infrastructure being rivers, and green infrastructures being grasslands, permeable surfaces, parks, and so forth. So the first thing to do in that context is to understand, well, what is the city actually made up of? What are the different typologies of spaces and spatial characteristics across the city, from high density, low rise historic environments to industrial environments to brownfield to rail infrastructure and so forth. And so we utilized both artificial intelligence and machine learning together with satellite data to start to classify these different land use patterns and gain quite a large scale holistic understanding of the different land use patterns in Shanghai. And that, of course, gave us then an insight in terms of where different solutions may or may not be possible in the context of interventions. If we then look at the proportion, it gives you a really interesting map of what the different elements in the city are and how they kind of make up different neighborhoods and different part of the city. And that again was then the starting point to marry that with what possible solutions could be, from localized storage to ensure that over a certain time you could store stormwater runoff to ensure that the drainage system wasn't overloaded, to planted retention basins, to temporary floodable public realm. This could be, a playground or a street that could be flooded where water could be held in a safe environment, to much more permeable paving and so forth. And then, of course, also an optimized river network as, if you like, the blue approach to this piece of infrastructure. And so the digital tools that we utilized here really enable the focus on integrating green, blue, and gray infrastructure and to develop an optimized city scale approach. And I think this is really important because we see here a city as a very complex system. We utilize the technology to break down and simplify that complexity. And that insight then gives us an opportunity to really think about possible intervention in a much more integrated way than we could have done before. And also, of course, at scale to really identify where interventions would be most feasible and return the highest value in terms of investment made. Now, collectively, thinking about both regenerative design and thinking about, the evolution of cities and going forward and the future of cities, we always like to understand the future in both preferable futures and probable futures. So if you think about going into the future, there's this cone of the possible, which is always increasing, and there's a future that is more probable, and there might be a future that's more preferable. And often these kind of foresight exercises that we do in that context are also about, first of all, understanding system complexity today, because you cannot move into the future and explore the future if you don't understand the present state. And I think in that sense, a lot of what we're trying to achieve is again not about prediction but about influencing probabilities. And there's a nice quote by Elon Musk which he said at TED 2017 where he said, "I look at the future from a standpoint of probabilities. It's like a branching stream of probabilities," which takes us back to that cone on the left here. And there are actions that we can take that affect those probabilities or that accelerate one thing or slow down another. And so this is really what a lot of this for me is about. It's about having conversations, building systems that break down complexity and that allow us then to figure out which probabilities we really want to impact and change in order to shape these more sustainable, more resilient and forward-looking cities and urban environments. And that's me. Please do get in touch if you would like, and I'll hand back now and stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hargrave, for the sharing on the future of resilient cities. For the panel discussion, I would like to invite Moderator Zhongwen to kickstart the discussion. Zhongwen, please.
Thank you, Ishan, and I would like to thank our three speakers for many good points that you have raised, and perhaps I think it's a point where we could also have invite you to have the mic on, and I think it will be quite useful at this point, where I think everyone has heard from our three speakers. I mentioned earlier about how I feel that when we look at understanding the entire set of urban systems, it's sort of quite involved in trying to connect the dots. Right? I mentioned about how I think we may not fully see all the connections, we may not be fully aware of all the dots, but I thought the three presentations have offered us new dots and new connections. And perhaps that's where I want to start in this discussion as the moderator, to see whether we could see some of the connections across all the three speakers' presentations, and to help us find a way forward. I think one of the common threads that all three speakers have touched on is really on this issue of the ability with data today, with simulation capabilities today, that we can have a better understanding of what is happening and better anticipate or forecast the future. And I think, as Prof. Batty mentioned, all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. All predictions are wrong, but some are more useful than others. I think in this current age where there's a significant interest in how we use data and modeling to improve the way we make decisions, there is also often a very natural questions about how good are the models and how accurate are they in forecasting the future, given that the future is quite uncertain. Perhaps I understand, I mean, earlier I shared a question on how do you see the way to connect these two dots, but perhaps I also want to ask your views on this question of usefulness. How do we make it useful? Is usefulness focused more on the model, or is the usefulness focused more on how we use the models, or is there other concerns that we should be thinking about? Perhaps I invite Prof. Batty first for your views on this.
It's a very important point. It's absolutely fundamental because in some senses, I think what we've learned, or what we should learn, and we're continuing to learn it, is indeed what George Box said: all models are wrong, but some are useful. And in the sense of, if all models are wrong, how do we test them? The point you've just raised is, how can you say a model is good if you know in advance that it's going to be wrong in some sense? And that is a basic dilemma. It is the dilemma of, what's the dilemma of unpredictability and modern life, really, in some sense. And it's not just in the human systems. I mean, the same sorts of inability to predict relate to physical systems in some senses. So I think this is a very interesting thing. I mean, and if you look historically, I mean, I was trained in this area from way back in the 60s when computers were very different and so on. And the models that we ran did produce, these were land use transport models, did produce quite good results, basically. That if you compared I mean, there were a number of tricks involved to do with statistical calibration, statistical correlation and so on. But nevertheless, they produced quite good results. But they produced rather unusual results as soon as we began to predict with them. And it looked at right from the beginning, there was this difficulty over how good the model was. It looked good in terms of comparing it with existing data. You model the change between 1960 and 1970, or the 1970 situation, and you get a good calibration in that sense. But prediction was a real problem. And that's the dilemma we've got. How do we deal? And I think we have to fall back on issues not to do with whether the model reproduces the data. Plausibility is important. Complex cities are complex systems, infinitely complex, and in some senses we need to point to things that are useful for our problem. Another question you say, I think the last question you've got is about the problem, and I think that's very important too. We need to look at the relationship between the problem and the model in much more detail, or the models and the tools. I'm going to stop at that point. I know I've gone on a little bit too long.
Well, thanks, Prof. Batty. Maybe next, Roman, would you share your thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting question, and I agree completely. Most models are grown, but some are useful. And I think the usefulness comes when the model interacts with the expert or the modeler. So the most useful thing from models for me, especially from complex models, is that sometimes you get a surprise. And that surprise, there are two options. Either the model is completely grown, or either there is something that you never thought about that has emerged and that helps you to think in a different way. So perhaps the model is not able to predict, but it helps us to steer our thinking towards a different direction and to refine our system. So I see it as something iterative. And yes, I think there is a room for complex science models because they will help us to refine the way we think and the way we do things.
I think one of the points that Roman and you and Prof. Batty have a sort of alluding to is really on this issue of problem. Does the model tries to elucidate or answer the problem we are trying to look at? Is that a good way to frame what you are thinking about in terms of this?
Well, I think, yeah, model is a way to conceptualize the system, the problem. So we have this understanding of the system and we are going to put it in this model. And then we are going to start running simulations with the model. And then that doesn't mean it solves the problem, but what Prof. Batty was saying, some of the predictions are off. Why are they off? Is it because we are missing some component of the system that is quite important? And through this iterative process, we start to understand better the system. We never have a full understanding, but we start getting to be able to manage better.
So I think it's also a good point to turn to Joseph. I mean, I think there's a lot of connections I feel in what we discussed and what Foresight often focuses on in trying to really look ahead at what are some of the issues we may need to pay attention to, and naturally the use of models to try to look at these issues that informs various kind of decisions. So whether what are your thoughts on this particular connection on how do we make the models useful, and useful not just in terms of perhaps representing the world as best as possible, but useful also in the kind of decisions and actions that we take?
Yeah, I think you've perfectly summarized it in your last few words there, because you're right. In Foresight, we often do scenario planning exercises, for example, where we draw alternative, plausible, consistent future worlds. And of course, in a way they can be described as as a form of modeling in itself, but perhaps more objective and more subjective to being shaped by opinion and being shaped by conversations. And the same can be true in terms of the purpose for more data-driven models, because at the end of the day they are designed to aid conversations and decision-making processes. And often the conversations and decisions that happen are more important than the process of generating the underlying model. And that would be true for the Shanghai Urban Drainage Master Plan, as it would be for a subjective set of scenarios for the future. It's really about enabling more meaningful conversations by leadership or by stakeholder groups, and increasing our confidence in decision-making processes. And so I think we have to again go back to the purpose of the model and the purpose of any exercise, whether it's kind of foresight or anything else. Understand what outcomes we're trying to achieve, and then make an assessment of whether our approach to modeling is a useful addition to that decision-making process, perhaps can make it more robust, can engage a broader amount of stakeholders, or just lead to a more clearly defined outcomes.
Perhaps, Joseph, I want to also build on the point that Roman mentioned earlier about the connection of the domain expertise with what we are trying to do in terms of modeling. And in understanding the city, which has many different urban systems, naturally it crosses many domains. And I wonder if from your perspective, when you are also looking at various set of possible driving forces and trends that we need to look out for, how do you see this issue of bringing together the domain knowledge or maybe the domain expertise given that there's such a wide range of domains involved?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And when we do foresight programs, our first focal point is always to try to understand the driving forces within a system. And we call them the so-called key factors. And they are not necessarily trends, but they are the kind of the areas of investigation which we know have, or which we assume have the highest amount of impact on its future shape, if that makes sense. And typically, that includes quite a broad set of factors from various different domains. So it includes technological factors, political factors, economic, environmental, and social factors, and sometimes also aspects of legal and value-driven factors. And so this kind of holistic approach is really, really critical always to our investigations of the future, because everything is interconnected and everything is part of a wider system. And so mapping out that system at a level of granularity that is as holistic as possible, but still manageable, is kind of the first step. And then when we do the investigation, we tend to take a very multidisciplinary approach to participation in those processes, where if we're working with a government, we would, for example, anticipate that all the different government departments would come together, so that you have that multi-stakeholder perspective on a theme, and not just a single perspective. And so having a diverse set of views in terms of backgrounds, ages, ethnicity, and so forth is really, really critical to have those conversations, because it does highlight, again, how different opinions matter, in particular when it comes to understanding complex systems.
I think there's also an interesting point that I thought we could discuss further on. It's really how when we involve different domains, and many of these domains being quite socio-economic in nature, many of these socio-economic are really about people's choices and behaviors. And while we may want to see whether there's a certain general tendency or there's a certain stable way the choices are made, probably we are actually looking at things that evolve and are very adaptable. Perhaps I thought one common thread that both Prof. Batty and Roman, you talk about, both in terms of mobility and the social communities, as well as how you connect to how people's behaviors in the use of amenities change. They are all about behaviors and choices. So I wonder whether you have any suggestions and thoughts on what should we be focusing on, perhaps, that will improve our understanding of how these choices and behaviors are made, and how do we approach the issue of trying to look ahead if these choices and behaviors are constantly evolving and adapting?
Well, there are several behavioral postulates that really underpin many of our models, not all by any means, and they relate to the role of space and time and distance and travel cost and things of that sort. And we find it very difficult to move away from some of those really very plausible issues, that if you are traveling, you're more likely to travel a shorter distance than a longer distance. You would prefer to travel shorter than longer, okay, with qualifications. Those sorts of things are very problematic. We find it very difficult to throw them away. Yet there are many, many instances now where those sort of basic constraints, if you like, on, say, travel or mobility, are really no longer of the same import, really, as they were in that context. Now, that's just true of travel behavior and networks and flows. There are many, many networks, etc., where we don't really have any information at all. If you look at email networks, for example, I'm aware of one or two people like Batty and so on who've done a little bit of work on this, about mapping email networks, but generally speaking, it's a closed book, and the same with virtually many of these networks that have emerged, as computers have become all pervasive in that sense. So in other words, there are literally thousands of networks which really relate to different domains. So connecting up the different domains that are relevant to the city, one might be able to begin to make progress by looking at their respective networks. But there are some major issues. Some of the networks I showed, we have some maps of them, but that's about it, really, in a sense. how people actually behave relative to those networks, email networks and so on, is again just a closed book, really. We just don't have any data on it in that sense. And this is a really big issue, I think, that there are almost as many perspectives on the city as there are people who live in cities, really. I mean, it is sort of saying that you know, general theory is very problematic in that sense to think about cities. But nevertheless, I personally think that the problem focus is the way forward. In other words, that every problem we have, and the problems change almost daily, really, in some sense, but certainly change quite rapidly. Every problem we have, I think, needs to be treated afresh. That's what makes it very difficult to produce generic solutions. Even transport models are not really generic. They're built by consultants and adapted to a particular context. We'll never reach a state where we have software like we've got in GIS, for example, which is pretty basic stuff, you know, in terms of computer mapping, largely because the problems that we've got to address are idiosyncratically different. I mean, the problem of transport in Singapore is totally different from London, as you know, Zhongwen. I mean,
maybe Roman.
I'll stop at that point.
Yeah, no, I think that it's very hard to predict social behavior, but our best bet is to try to bring together the different domain experts, get them to talk the same language. And I think that integrating all the social scientists with people that do more like the simulations, the computer scientists, I think there's much to be gained there. And sometimes we don't get them in the same room, the people that actually might be able to model the behavior or to elicit preferences, the anthropologists, the social experts. They need to talk to each other and try to put it into the model. And through that integration, I think is the way we can learn. I agree that it's very hard to measure, and it changes fast. So ideally, we will have a way to collect data almost real time. I think social media offers some opportunity. I mean, it's biased, but more work on harvesting social media, text analysis, data analysis, linking that to maps, mobile phone data. I think that gives us an opportunity to understand complex behavior, or at least to try to follow and see how it updates.
Maybe if I expand that question, and I suspect many of the audiences are interested to understand your thoughts on this. Is this issue of, I think as we look ahead, it's very clear that how we look at digital technologies, and everyone is looking at how AI is evolving. There's a lot of interest in saying how will the digital and AI economy and the city of the future change the way people behave. But more closer to heart, I'm sure many people are also asking, how will COVID-19, the post-COVID-19 city look like in terms of, do we likely see behaviors returning to what it was pre-COVID, or do we likely see a new normal? And I think this would be a very common question that I'm sure you have faced, and I'm sure many of the audience will be interested to hear your thoughts on how do we approach it, and what do you think the post-COVID-19 city will look like, and perhaps in the longer term, the one as we look at the use of AI technologies.
Well, I guess there's, yeah, I'll start and then we'll see. I guess there's again no singular answer to this, and I think it'll be very different from one city to another, like Michael has already said. I guess the commonality that we have at the moment is that we are not yet out of the crisis phase, and so the new equilibrium of what, you know, live, work, play relationship of people in urban environments looks like is not yet clear. There's starting to be some hints, but how they will stick and how that will evolve over the coming years is very, very difficult to predict at the moment. And it does also show the challenge of modeling in a way, right? Because if we think about how transport will have been modeled pre-pandemic, the impacts of lockdown and the impacts on shifts in behavior have been, particularly difficult for public transport networks and their financing and their projections into the future. One of the areas that we're looking at quite extensively is work and commercial offices and the future of central business districts, because that is something that closely relates to our interest in property. And there we are anticipating that in most regions, a new hybrid working model will evolve, and that has interesting implications in terms of how many days of the week will people travel into the city to work, which days will be busier, what impact will that have on the dynamics of the local economy and people's behavior, and so there's a lot of debate happening around that at the moment. And the consequences, while they may seem simple in some ways, okay, we need less space for our workers, are actually much more complicated, because maybe you need more space because the people that will come in will want to collaborate more and interact more, and as a consequence they need more larger spaces with less desks. And so there's some really, really challenging questions emerging that a lot of people are grappling with. And so it's a bit of an interesting age also for asking people what they think. So there's a lot of surveys going around to figure out, well, how many days of the week do you want to work in the future inside of the office? And so it'll be an interesting time to really see how it all settles and how this new equilibrium emerges, and how there will be differences from one region and cultural context to another.
I know the organizer is asking me to wrap up, but I would like to ask Roman for this last question and to develop a bit further. I think you shared about the research looking at how people in Singapore are using the green spaces, and I think COVID-19 is where we have seen a significant growth in people using parks and nature areas. How do you see the research that you have started to look at go forward? And I mean, being situated in Singapore, looking at some of these pet behaviors in Singapore, how do you think that the way we approach the problems, the topics going forward would be useful to be able to allow the research outcomes as well as the insights to inform the way we plan for our city?
Yeah, I think COVID has been a challenge, and they have. One of the main lessons in Singapore is that our green spaces are very important to us. And as you were saying, people that normally wouldn't go to green blue spaces, they are going now. And they are finding us a relief, right? And I think we moving forward, I'm hoping that some people will have discovered this wealth of green spaces we have, and there will be more utilization. But it's hard to predict, and I think some of the other things will come. I think we have lost many of our social interactions, especially big family gatherings. I think they are what makes us Singapore. So I think that one will come back. But we have to be ready for people spending more time at home, and we have to be aware of the issue that working without aircon is hard, or that we might want to make sure that everybody has a good view of greenery. So I think that's going to pose some of the urban planning challenges if we continue having to work at home, or if that will change. But yeah, in terms of using green spaces, I think there's a radical change, and I hope it will stay.
Thanks, Roman. I would attempt to try to fully summarize quite a diverse range of advice and suggestions that our speakers have given. But I hope that it is useful for our audiences to take back and think about how some of these points could be useful and relevant, both in how we apply the lens of complexity in our work and how we look at opportunities to really build new conversations and new ways of understanding the different aspects of the city, so that we can make our cities more adaptable and resilient. So with this, I thank our speakers and I hand back to the organizers.
Thank you, Prof. Batty, Dr. Carrasco, and Mr. Hargrave for the interesting conversations today. And thank you, Zhongwen, for moderating today's session. We hope to see you at the upcoming e-symposium webinars, which you can register for via the QR codes shown later. Do visit the Urban Sustainability R&D portal and WCS website for more information too. Thank you.